My name is Noah Wistman. I'm a student at the CUNY Graduate Center's program for Educational Psychology, PhD program. And this here is a presentation, a biography presentation about the educational psychologist Anne Leslie Brown. I made this presentation for one of the classes that I took as part of my graduate program. The assignment was to create a presentation that was a biography of an educational psychologist. And I chose Anne Brown because I had read some of her work, gotten a lot out of it, and she seemed like an interesting person to learn about. And I was really happy to learn more about her for this assignment. And her work and learning about how she went about her work has had an influence on me in the way that I view education and the way that I view research. I think Anne Brown was an underrated psychologist and researcher, and I'm happy to be giving this presentation again, this time for video. Okay, so we will start from the beginning. So Anne Brown was born in an air raid shelter in 1943 during the tail end of World War II. Back in the day in Britain, um, when there was German air raids, they would drop bombs on various British cities and countryside. Um, People would build these sort of bunkers in their backyards and in the streets where they could go underneath to hopefully survive if a bomb blast went off near them. And Anne Brown was born in one of these air raid shelters. Not this one in particular, this is just an example of one in a backyard. Of course, Anne Brown was born in the tail end of World War II, so when she was a kid, the war had already ended, and she grew up in post-war Portsmouth, England. Here's a picture of Portsmouth in the 50s when she was growing up. You can see that Portsmouth is a seaside city. It's in sort of the south of England. And here we see a warship from the World War II still in the harbor, still patrolling. Here's a picture of a street in Portsmouth from the time as well. Very British, you know. As you can see, Portsmouth was a city, you know. I think you saw some industrial architecture in the previous slide. And here you see some public transportation, people in cars, people in bicycles, local shops. And here's a picture of one of Portsmouth's kind of seaside activity areas. Portsmouth was and is a sort of seaside destination location, a place to go if you want to get near a beach and catch a few rays. Of course, it is a little bit more of a city. It's not just a tourist area, but this is definitely a big part of life over there, was and is. And here's a picture from a elementary school in the area, primary school as they call it over there, which is the kind of school that Anne Brown would have attended growing up. Again, not the exact school, I couldn't find that. But if you think about this era of education, you know, this is very much, especially in Britain, this era of, you know, formalized education. You can see everybody's in their nice little suit here. I always think of Pink Floyd's The Wall and, you know, We Don't Need No Education and that whole era of the British school. So this is the kind of school that Anne Brown would have gone to. By the way, I found all these images in a Portsmouth newspaper archive, which is very useful for my research. So now a very quick, very brief history of Anne Brown's life leading up to her career as a researcher. So Anne Brown had dyslexia, and dyslexia did not become a very common diagnosis for people until the 1960s. It had been described a while before that, but it didn't really become understood as a condition, as a learning disability until the 60s, and as such, interventions were very limited as well. When Brown was growing up in the 50s, you know, it was rare to even know that you had dyslexia, much less find anybody who could help you with it. And maybe because of this, Anne Brown did not learn to read until the age of 13. Um, at least not fully, not to the degree to which you could finish a whole book or anything like that, which is a very late age to learn how to read. Jumping ahead a little bit, after she gets into university, she makes honor roll at the University of London, and she receives her PhD in psychology at the age of just 24 in 1967, which is a very prodigious age to get your PhD. And, it begs the question of, like, what even happened in between these two things? I mean, you don't know how to read until you're 13, and somehow you do such a extraordinary turnaround. You're supposedly so far behind, and then not so long later, you're making honor roll at your university and getting your PhD there as well. It's an incredible turnaround, and I think a lot of Anne Brown's career as a researcher and as an educator is going to be informed by this experience of being someone who was behind and who not only managed to catch up but managed to go all the way around and get out ahead in terms of her academic success. And a lot of Anne Brown's career is going to be about trying to answer the question of, like, how do you do that? We'll see that in the topics that she chooses to research. Along these lines, I believe that Anne Brown was a very private person. This is something that I've determined, having looked into Anne Brown's personal history. There's not a lot of information out there, and that's despite the fact that Anne Brown, we're going to see later, lands some relatively high-profile positions. She's on the member of this board and that executive committee. And she certainly could have written her biography and told her story and promoted herself, but she chose not to. And what we're going to see as we look through Anne Brown's career is that she's someone who we're going to know through her work. We will get glimpses into her personal life, but I get the sense that she wanted to keep the focus on what she did and what she discovered, rather than who she was. But again, we will get some glimpses at Anne Brown the person throughout the presentation. Okay. And here we have one of those glimpses. This is a transcript of the inaugural address that Brown gave when she was made the president of the American Educational Research Association, which is still around today. And you can see here that we do get a little bit of Anne Brown's personal life. This is one of the few sources I could find where she did talk about her own upbringing. She starts off over here with some theoretical background about education and science and learning, the advancement of learning. Bacon, Vygotsky get brought up. And then we have this little transition here where she talks about the previous president of American Educational Research Association, and she talks about how she's going to give you a little personal history. So from here we learn that when she was in high school, she specialized in 18th century literature and 19th century history, and was going to study history in college. And this is a classic, twist of fate kind of thing, who knows how life comes to you. But she sees a television program on animal learning and how animals learn naturally in their environments, and all of a sudden she decides that, well, I guess I'll switch to psychology. This is so fascinating to me. And she reads one psychology book, Freud's Psychopathology of Everyday Life. She goes and does an interview at a university, and wouldn't you know it, the head of the department was an expert in 18th century literature. They talk about that the whole time, and then she gets a scholarship to study psychology. It's just one of these classic stories. And so she gets to the university, and she describes how, again, it's a huge transition moment for her. She's grown up in a medium, small city, and now she's going off to the university. Like a lot of people, it's a very transformative experience for them. And unfortunately for her, the dominant perspective at the University of London in the 1960s was behaviorism, the behaviorist approach to psychology and learning psychology. Skinner, Tolman, Spence, and those kinds of people. And if you know anything about behaviorism, you know that it's a very stripped down, formal, experimental, kind of piecemeal way of looking at learning and looking at psychology. It doesn't strike one as the kind of perspective that would resonate with someone who's a fan of 18th century literature and history. And so maybe this feeling of restriction and mismatch between theoretical perspective and personal interests and inclinations is going to explain a lot of Brown's deviation from the behaviorist tradition as soon as she gets her PhD and starts doing her own work. So that's a little glimpse of the sort of in-between period of Anne Brown's life. But I also think that we can learn about Brown's personality based on what she doesn't say. I wanted to sort of highlight this particular paragraph here. If you read the language that she's using here, she says, like, I'll begin with a personal odyssey. In rereading the president addresses from the past 10 years or so, I realized that this genre, the Odyssey, is a popular one. Indeed, you read it and you go, okay, it's like she's reluctant to talk about herself. She's saying, like, oh, this is a very popular thing to do. I see that telling your personal story, that's kind of what everybody seems to do with these kinds of things. The last guy did it. I guess I'm supposed to be doing it, Here's my problem. I don't really know what to say. She doesn't, I get the sense she doesn't want to talk about herself. And then she does talk about herself for, another, 5 minutes or so, just a little brief history. And then from about here on to the entire rest of the speech, and it goes on for another 10 pages worth of writing, however many minutes that is in presentation time. For the whole rest of this speech, it's the work that she's doing, her research, her findings, competing theoretical perspectives. It's all science, learning, research, all professional. You get 3 paragraphs, 4 paragraphs of personal history, and then it's just business, science, learning. And I get the sense that this is really who Anne Brown was. She's someone whose real passion was in her work and in the transformation that she believed it could bring around. Okay. So jumping back ahead into the timeline, we see that Anne Brown does get her PhD from the University of London, and she gets a postdoc position and eventually a professorship at the University of Illinois. And she stays there from 1968, when she starts the postdoc program, to 1988, when she's teaching there as a professor. Here we see the front lawn of the University of Illinois, which I'm told to this day is still a favored hangout spot for students. Okay. So during the PhD postdoc program at the University of Illinois, Anne Brown meets fellow educational psychologist Joseph Campione. And Joseph Campione has a whole career in his own right. You could probably do a video on him. So they meet in 1968 in the program, and they get married in 1970, which is a pretty quick turnaround time. I imagine they must have hit it off really well. And together they form just like a classic research power couple, like the Curies. There's been a number of these kinds of couples throughout the history of science where someone who's really into something and someone else who's really into something get together and they research together and they publish together and they influence each other's thinking. And Brown and Campione definitely do this. Their names are together in a bunch of papers, and one gets the sense that they pull each other into their respective directions. Note that this picture of Joseph Campione is, relatively recent. It's not from the 1970s. Campione also seems to be a relatively private person. I imagine that they sort of shared this in their relationship. Campione has published as recently as like 2017, the 2010s, but has almost no online presence. I found this picture. This was a Quora profile picture. And he posted like twice. He answered like 2 questions, and then he never posted there again. And this is the only particularly modern picture I could find of him. So again, I think he's also relatively private. Okay. So through the 1970s, during the postdoc program, I believe that this is a period in Anne Brown's career marked by shifting influences. And this is pretty typical of people when they get their PhD, they start their postdoc program, they're still figuring out exactly what they stand for and exactly what they want to research. And you see a kind of shift in the primary influences of Anne Brown's thinking and behavior and approaches to research and education. One of the major shifts in terms of influence was from the perspectives brought around by Jean Piaget to those of Lev Vygotsky. And Brown was one of many educational psychologists and developmental psychologists who were influenced by Vygotsky's work as it was made available to the West. Vygotsky was Russian. His works had been suppressed by the Soviet Union for a number of decades, and it was only in the 1960s or so that they started to be translated and made available to Western countries. And they're very influential. Vygotsky emphasized the social elements of learning as opposed to the individual elements, to put it in one sentence. We also see a shift in Anne Brown's research from specific strategies that will increase learning in a particular context to strategies for learning that will work across contexts and will lead to learning that can apply across contexts. This is called transfer in the sort of modern parlance, and Anne Brown was on the sort of cutting edge of developing this idea of the transfer of knowledge, the idea that you can know something in one context, but you may or may not be able to use it again in another context. So Anne Brown starts to research this idea more specifically. And the other thing you see a shift in Anne Brown's work is from purely theoretical research meant to understand learning in the abstract to research that exists in the meeting point between theory and practice. And this is something we're going to see described in more detail later. This idea that Anne Brown felt that theory should arise from practice and practice should arise from theory. The two should be complementary rather than separate. So here are some screenshots of just Google Scholar papers by Anne Brown. Anne Brown's one of the main publishers from 1970 to 1980. And hopefully in some of these titles you can see some of these themes coming up and shifting. I particularly would like to note 1979, the zone of potential development, which is a Vygotskyan concept. Implications for intelligence testing in the year 2000, trying to look ahead as well. Okay. So throughout the 1970s and 1980s and 90s, really throughout her entire career, but starting in the 1970s, Brown innovates this idea of a design experiment, at least innovates it in the context of education research. And this is related to that shift Brown makes from pure theory into theory combined with practice. And this is the goal of the design experiment, to combine theory and practice. In this 1992 paper, Anne Brown summarizes the approach that she had been using for the past several decades. You can see this has been cited a good number of times as well. It's over 7,000. And so the question is, what is a design experiment and what is it in the context of education research? Well, to understand that, first you have to understand where this idea came from. If you see here in the description of the study, the idea of a design experiment were modeled on the procedures of design sciences like aeronautics and artificial intelligence. So what is a design experiment in the context of, say, aeronautics? Well, the idea is, again, using the metaphor for aeronautics research, that let's say we want to make a better plane. This is a common goal that we might have. And we want to make that plane more aerodynamic. We want to make it so that it has less drag, it uses less fuel, it's just a more efficient machine overall. Well, to do that, we might want to say improve its trail fin. We might want to make it so that the fin causes less disturbance in the air as it moves. Well, what we would do in, say, a traditional experiment is we would take the tail fin that we have now, design a new tail fin, put both of them into a wind turbine, have the wind turbine blow past one of them, have the wind turbine blow past the other one, and see which one causes less drag. Whichever one causes less drag, if the new one we made causes less drag, we can replace the old one with the new one. Makes sense. This is a sort of traditional experimental design. But there's a problem with this design, and that is that the drag created, the aerodynamic efficiency of the tail fin, does not exist in isolation, but it's dependent on how wind is moving around the plane as a whole. The way that wind hits this tail fin is going to be different if it's been already moving across the whole of this plane compared to if it's just coming down the wind turbine for the first time. So you can't make a good definitive statement about which fin is better than the other when you're testing them in isolation. You have to test them as part of the composite whole in order to make a statement about its aerodynamic efficiency. Okay, so the way that this is done in the field of aerodynamics is that rather than just making a new fin and testing it against one other fin, you instead make a whole plane, put it in the wind turbine, put one fin on, test that aerodynamic efficiency, then take that fin out, put the new fin on, test that aerodynamic efficiency. Rather than testing them in isolation, test them in the context of the whole body of the plane. And this way, you'll get to see how its aerodynamic efficiency is in the context of the body of the entire plane, which is necessary to understand how it's really going to work when you put it on a real plane and you go out and fly the thing. And just like you can do this with the tail fin, so you can do this with any aspect of the plane. You can do a new cockpit, a new fuselage position. Anything you want to test, you have to make sure you're doing it in the context of an entire plane hull, not just on its own, because it won't really mean anything on its own. And by doing this over and over, by taking out one piece of the whole plane and replacing it with a new piece, and then trying a new piece out somewhere else, and a new piece in somewhere else, and switching pieces out, and comparing and contrasting with previous performances, over time will slowly improve the overall design of the plane. Make a better and better airplane. Okay. So that's how design experiments work in an aeronautics context. That's the argument of why they're necessary in that context. How does that apply to education research? How did Brown take these ideas and transition them to education research? Well, the idea goes something like this. Rather than taking a new educational approach and testing it in isolation, you want to test that new educational approach in the context of a whole class, a whole fully run class, so that you can see what that new approach does in the context of that whole class, because what it does on its own and what it does in the context of a whole class may not be the same thing. So a design experiment in the education research involves the following steps. First, you design and run a full class, several weeks, some kind of grading, some kind of evaluation, some kind of content, some kind of study materials, just a full class of some description. Then you measure the outcomes, the learning outcomes that are obtained from that class. Then you change something about that class. Presumably, you're going to change something that's based in some kind of educational theory rather than just making some random change and hoping it works out, because we'd like to see how the theory can contribute to the practice. And then you're going to measure the outcomes again. Same educational outcomes you measured before, and you're going to compare how people did when the first time that you measured the outcomes to how they did after you make this change. And in doing so, you'll learn about what this change does in the context of this full class. This way of doing research was extremely innovative at the time. At the time, it was still standard to do education research in sort of laboratory settings where you tested one approach to another approach in relative isolation. Actually going and running an entire class and measuring things that way was relatively rare when Brown started doing it. And she also added another step onto the process, which is to repeat these last two steps. So first you design the class, you measure outcomes, then you change something, you measure outcomes again, and then you change something else about the class, and you measure the outcomes again. And then you change something else about the class, and you measure the outcomes again. And just like with the airplane where we keep trying new parts and building a better and better model, we keep trying new parts for the class and try to build a better and better model of the class itself. The approach to education. And again, this way of doing things, having a full class, continuously running it and updating it, and testing based on previous performance, was not something people were doing very much before Anne Brown started doing it in the 70s or so. This approach to education research has become very common, and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about her lasting influences. So what are the advantages of this approach as opposed to a traditional experiment? Well, now you know what this change, this particular approach to education does in the context of a full class. And you can see progression of that change in that approach over time. It was common for Anne Brown to run a classroom with a certain design philosophy and then run a follow-up class with the same philosophy to see how those effects could compound. You're able to simultaneously contribute to learning theory and to learning practice. You're able to compare theoretical differences by implementing something that's based on this theory versus implementing something that's based on this theory. And everything you find is directly relevant to the educational practice of a real classroom because you're running a real classroom. You don't have to worry as much about translation effects between lab settings and classroom settings. And this is important, this is something that Brown really emphasizes in this paper here, you're able to chain studies together. You can use results that you get from lab-like experiments to inform the class that you're designing, and use the results from that class to inform longitudinal studies of how people learn over time. Anne Brown was very good at squeezing all of the juice out of the orange, so to speak, looking at the same design question from multiple angles. And she could do that because she ran them as continuous classes. This was very innovative at the time, and would still be today. So here's two examples of papers that Brown published, which I think showcased this difference in approach pretty well. On the left, we have a more traditional experimental design. This experiment tests the effects of rewarding all three positions or only the left and right positions in a three stimuli oddity problem, or three stimuli oddity problems. If this might sound like nonsense to you if you're not in educational psychology or developmental psychology, but if you are there, you know kind of what the study is. You get a baby or a child, you give them rewards based on three positions or only the left and right positions, and you see which one of them captures more attention, leads to more lasting recognition. It's a very isolated way of doing things. It's a very lab-like way of doing things. It's not a very naturalistic way of doing things. It has its own merits, but the innovation that Brown had was to switch from this way of doing research to this approach to doing research. Here you can see in this description, rather than setting up a lab and testing people in a kind of controlled experimental setting, we have here just a class that's meant to teach children with disabilities. Of course, they use the technical term for the time, which I will not be using, but to teach children with disabilities how to learn words and how to read. Very different from this lab-like environment here. This is just a class that's supposed to teach people things and is using certain methods and approaches to try to teach them that thing. Oh, and by the way, here's Campione on the paper. And this is part of a series of studies that Brown did with children with disabilities, trying to improve their ability to read. And again, these studies would be compared to themselves. The strategies that worked here would be tried again in the follow-up study and the one after that. Okay. So again, this is that shift in thinking. So the 1970s to the 1980s, Anne Brown takes this approach to research, takes the design experiment, and applies it to the topics of metacognition and transfer in reading. Metacognition is a big term in modern educational psychology research, as is transfer, and Anne Brown was kind of at the forefront of both of those topics. She wasn't the only person innovating these concepts. There are many other researchers who contributed to these ideas, but she was definitely on the cutting edge, and specifically she focused on reading as her subject and applying these concepts to the learning of reading. Here's some of the papers that she published from the 70s to the 80s. Comprehension fostering and comprehension monitoring are terms you may have heard of if you're in educational psychology, and she was one of the innovators of those, again, especially in reading. You can see this has been cited a good amount. We'll talk about this paper more. Summarizing texts, learning how to learn, strategic learning, self-control, learning to learn and learning from examples. All analogical learning and transfer, all of these things are things that have been very influential to the way that psychologists think about learning, and Brown was one of the sort of innovating forces in those types of studies. Okay. I would say that a lot of what we now think of as metacognitive approaches and comprehension-based approaches to reading were innovated by Brown at this time and may not necessarily be thought of as her own inventions by modern researchers. Okay. So during this era, from the 70s to the 80s, Brown develops, along with her student Anne-Marie Palanzar, probably her most well-known approach to education, and specifically reading comprehension, called reciprocal teaching. This is sort of the marquee paper as far as reciprocal teaching as an approach is concerned. And here you see Palanzar and Brown as the names on it. And you can see this paper has been cited, about 12,000 times, which is quite a number of times for an academic publication. Palanzar was Brown's mentee, sort of her grad student that she was coaching, and I believe this is the first, or maybe one of the first papers that Palanzar was the first name on. This was like her first passion project, which is pretty impressive for that to also be a really highly cited paper. But what was so innovative about reciprocal teaching was that it combined two different approaches to teaching. It combined the sort of metacognitive and transfer-based approaches that Anne Brown had been researching. Notably, it has students try to predict what's going to happen in a study, clarify things that they don't understand, question what's occurring and why it's occurring, and then summarize what they've found. All of these are metacognitive strategies. And it took these and combined them with sociocultural approaches to learning. Again, this is that Vygotskian influence. I think Palanzar was also an influence in this direction. Things like the teacher modeling to students what they should do. Students taking turns and taking the lead role in a discussion and a dialogue in which people's understanding is built together, not just on their own. Reciprocal teaching sort of combined those two approaches, and because of that, found some really powerful results. They were really able to improve students' reading comprehension, despite the fact that the students who they were researching came in with reading deficiencies. They were able to help them catch up and even to get ahead of their expected reading level. So very strong results. And Brown and Palansar would continue to work on reciprocal teaching throughout the rest of Brown's career, and Palansar still working on it today. Okay. So in 1988, Anne Brown was offered a position, tenured position at the University of California, Berkeley. Here's an aerial picture of the campus grounds, very beautiful campus. And Campione was also given a position at the university as well, so they moved out to California and started setting up shop there. Here's a picture of the two of them together at the university. Here's Campione and here's Brown. Another little glimpse into the personal life. I really did have to dig for this picture as well. This is from Berkeley Newsletter Archive, which tracks their publications going back several decades. And this was the two of them together at a research conference. Okay. So at Berkeley University, Anne Brown dedicated pretty much her entire time and the rest of her career towards one big project. One continuous project, again, very much a design experiment, very much I set up this design and then I continue to modify it and research it. And she called this approach to classroom design, this approach to research, this approach to education, fostering communities of learners. This is what she landed on, abbreviated to FCL. And Brown considered this to be her best work. Brown was always building on what she did before, and we'll see how FCL, the approach, builds on the stuff that she had discovered previously in her career. And she saw this as kind of the culmination of the work that she had been doing up until this point. Here is the beginning of a paper from 1997 where Brown summarizes the approach and the results that she's been finding based on its implementation. In this article, a program of research known as Fostering Communities of Learners is described. The program is in place in several schools and classrooms serving inner city students from 6 to 12 years of age. Based on theoretical advances in cognitive and developmental psychology, the program is successful in improving both literacy skills and domain area subject matter, e.g. environmental science and biology. Building on young children's emergent and strategic metacognitive knowledge, there we go, building on her previous work. Together with the skeletal biological theories, the program leads children to discover the deep principles of the domain and develop flexible learning and inquiry strategies of wide applicability. Again, here's that transfer idea. Always staying with and coming back from the previous research. So before talking about the FCL approach, I wanted to highlight this particular piece right here. You know, this is one of those things that gets turned into one sentence in a research article, in an abstract, but has a lot going on in it. This inner city students from 6 to 12 years of age. You know, who is this population, and why is Anne Brown working with them? So this is a picture of the Bay Area, where Anne Brown was situated at this time. Here's Berkeley, where the university is located. And you may have heard of this city here, which Berkeley is right next to, San Francisco. A famous city, one of the most well-known and biggest cities in the United States of America. A wealthy city, especially at this time in the 1980s. It's going through a real estate boom. Very desirable place to live. However, this is not where Anne Brown was doing research. She was not doing research in San Francisco. She was doing research here in Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco. And Oakland was not and is not a wealthy neighborhood. You know, Oakland is still the place that people live in when they can't afford to live in San Francisco. Especially during the 1980s, it was famous for its high rates of crime and unrest. This was during the crack epidemic, which hit Oakland particularly hard. And this is where Anne Brown was doing her research. She did her research in a number of schools in Oakland. And I wanted to highlight this because, Anne Brown very easily could have done her research in San Francisco. It's a hop, skip, and a jump from Berkeley to either one of these locations. She chose to do her research in Oakland. And I think that says something about her. If you take a second to think back on her career, she worked with, children with disabilities, students with disabilities. She worked with struggling readers, people who were behind their expected reading level. And now in this later stage of her career, she could probably work anywhere she wanted to. She chooses to work with children in poor and violent-ridden communities. I have in my head the sort of image of this warm, professional, British lady, probably still has some of the accent, going into these neighborhoods and trying to find a way to connect to these kids and teach them something and help them learn something. Again, I think it says something about her. Maybe connected to her own life, growing up with dyslexia, looking out for people who were being left behind. Okay. So, what is the Fostering Communities of Learners approach, FCL approach? Here is a quote from the 1997 paper from Jerome Bruner, also an educational psychologist, also of quite a bit of note, who visited the classrooms and identified 4 major themes in the classrooms. Themes of agency, this idea that students are taking control of their own learning and mental activity. This idea of reflection, the idea that you're not just learning things, but you're taking a moment to think about what you learned and how you learned it. Collaboration, here's that social element, that sociocultural element, that people are working together on things. And culture, this idea that we're not just learning things because we're in school. We're learning things because we're adopting a way of life where we're constructing and negotiating, institutionalizing, and after it's all, and this is a classic Jerome Bruner way of phrasing things, and finally, after it's all settled, end up by calling reality to comfort ourselves. We're adopting it to be our worldview, so to speak. And then Brown writes, unfortunately, I could not have said it better myself, which again I think is a little glimpse into her personality. Okay, that's the approach in the big picture. How does it actually work? Well, the idea for the Fostering Communities of Learners classrooms was to build on the reciprocal teaching approach that Brown had developed and was still developing with Palansar, and to combine it with a somewhat more obscure influence, this idea of the Jigsaw classroom, which was innovated by Aronson in 1979. And Aronson developed this approach to classroom design in response to the post-integration schools, post-Brown v. Board of Education, where you had black students and white students attending the same schools, but Aronson noticed that they were often hanging out in their own cliques. That yes, the schools were technically integrated, but really within the school there was still segregation, kind of adopted by the students of their own volition. And you may still see this if you go to high schools today. So Aronson's idea to try to break that ice and get people to mingle between each other was to create classrooms which had shared and specific responsibilities. So a white student and a black student and another white student and another black student would all be assigned to the same project. And they would all have different responsibilities to make that project successful. And by having to share responsibility with each other, work with each other, this would help them to break those social barriers. And it was very successful at the time. So Brown's idea was to take this approach of the Jigsaw classroom, combine it with reciprocal teaching and those metacognitive strategies, and create a classroom where those groups were being formed not just to break social barriers, but also to improve learning outcomes. Okay, So here's the procedure, and this is detailed. This is in the paper from 1997 in a pretty good amount of specificity. The idea goes something like this. And the example that's given in the paper is of an ecology project, but the idea of this approach is that it could be applied to any subject, and so I've used a different subject in this example. So the idea is that there's some kind of project, presentation, performance, just something that we, the students, are working towards producing, some kind of out product. We're not just learning to pass an exam or because the teacher told us to do so. It's to make something at the end of this whole process, whatever that thing is. In the original study, it was to design, quote unquote, the perfect animal and give a presentation about it in order to learn about ecology. In this case, we maybe would design a class to create a policy proposal, a change in public policy that the students would be recommending. This would be another kind of project that would fit the bill. So once you have this kind of general project we're working towards and you describe it to the students in the classroom, you then put people into groups, generally groups of 4, maybe 5, maybe 3. 4, I think, is a pretty standard size. And you give each person in that group a different role. And this is very important. This is taken from the reciprocal teaching approach. And it's important to give people different roles so that they each contribute something different to the project. And you don't run into this freeloader problem where one person does all of the work. So let's say, for example, that in order to create this policy proposal, it's one person's job to learn about the history of the policy that they're researching and what kind of things inform the way that we should think about today from the past. Meanwhile, another person's role could be to learn about the politics surrounding this issue. Who supports it, who doesn't, who we need to get on our side, and who will we manage to maybe be able to cordon off. Another person could look into the cost. How much would this cost to implement? Where would we get those funds from? Do we have to raise taxes? Do we have to cut spending? And another person's role could be to look into the writing of a policy proposal. What kind of structure does it need to have? What kind of points does it need to make? What kind of argument does it need to structure? And you can see how if we were to be missing any one of these pieces of information, we would not be able to create a successful policy proposal. So these 4 people are going to need to be able to work together in order to make a successful out product. Okay, so first of all, everybody gets assigned their role within the group that they're in. And then they're given some resources to read, to watch, to interact with that will hopefully teach them about the specific area that they're becoming an expert in, that they're researching. And so this might be some historical documents, it could be some research that's been published, some spreadsheets, whatever it is. You're given some resources to learn from and to analyze. And then this is an important stage in the process. This is again that jigsaw idea. You go from your initial group, which you're going to make the final proposal with, and you go to the other people from the other groups that have been formed that have the same role as you. So all the people who are given the history role in their respective groups, you meet with them. And all the people who are given the politics role in their group, you meet with them. And if you're given the cost role, you meet with the people who are given the cost role, and so on like this. And you discuss the readings, you discuss the materials that you've learned from together, and you cross-check the notes that you've taken, come up with ideas, come up with analyses, find things that you were missing in your own analysis. And through this process of reading it yourself, and then meeting and discussing with the other people who have read it, you become a sort of sub-expert in this particular element of the overall project. Okay. Then, after you've met with your sort of subgroups, you go back to your original group and you talk about what you've learned. And this is usually done in a particular sequence. Again, this is taken from the reciprocal teaching approach. So let's say that we start with the person who learned about history. Well, what they're going to do is they're going to consider all the things that they learned and discuss with the other people who learned about history, and they're going to teach everybody else in the group about it. And as they discuss what we learned about the history of this particular policy with the other people in the group, those people are able to give them feedback. They're able to make comments and make their own points based on their own area of expertise. How does what you're saying about the history interact with what I learned about the politics of the situation? How does what you're saying about the history interact with what it's going to cost? How does what you're saying about the history, how are we going to fit that into the way we write this? So everybody is able to make a contribution based on their own area of expertise. And then we repeat this process, but the person who learned about politics leads the conversation and makes all of the points that they feel are key that they discovered. And everyone gives them feedback based on their own expertise. And then through this process of different people taking the lead of the conversation, sharing what they know, other people giving feedback based on what they know, all the students sort of combine their understanding to form a collective understanding, which is ultimately what needs to be achieved to create a successful policy proposal. There you go. You may have noticed that I have not really mentioned a teacher very much throughout this process, and that's by design. The role of a teacher in an FCL classroom is to be more of a background figure, not be talking all the time, to not be leading all the time, but more to first of all set up what the goals are and what the structure is going to be, and then to provide guidance and feedback to the students as they undertake their own research and their own discussions. It's to walk around from group to group and check in on how they're doing, clarify any points of confusion, give feedback, oh, I don't know if that conclusion is right, I think you should redo that. It's to be much more of a guide and much less of a lecturer. That's the role of the teacher in the FCL classroom. And this way students are able to further refine their thinking and further refine their eventual, in this case, proposal. So again, through all these influences, everyone working together, we eventually create the formal policy proposal, and there's the successfully completed project. And very often, in addition to this, there'll be some kind of, again, performance, some kind of public presentation. You'll finish the project and you won't just hand it in for a grade, but you'll show it to the rest of the class, or you'll post it up in the hallway for people to see, or parents and members of the community will be invited to come and see the results of all the hard work you just did. And this acts as a motivating factor. It acts as a way of getting people to feel like they're really accomplishing something, not just doing work for the sake of doing work. There are a number of other practices associated with the FCO classroom that Anne Brown was still working on and still working on incorporating, various metacognitive strategies and things of these nature. But this is really the core of it right here, and it's plenty to consider just from that core. Okay. So this again was Anne Brown's pretty much sole focus of research from 1988 to 1999. She saw it as her best work, and there were some really impressive results coming out of these classrooms. Kids reading way beyond their expected reading level, learning a lot about the topics that they were covering, and just generally seeming engaged and seeming vibrant, and a classroom that, again, was, as the name suggests, trying to create a community and culture of learning, not just learning because I need to pass this class. However, despite the success of this program, the apparent success of this program, FCL as an approach has not been as influential as reciprocal teaching. And I believe this is for a couple of key reasons. The first, of course, is that it requires a much higher commitment than reciprocal teaching. Reciprocal teaching as an educational approach is something you can splash into a classroom that isn't primarily or solely focused on it, whereas if you're going to do an FCL classroom, you really have to commit to a full semester, a full year of this approach. It's very high commitment. Related to this, you really need dedicated teacher training. If you're going to implement this approach, someone needs to commit to teaching this kind of classroom, which is very different from a traditional classroom. They need to redefine their own role within the classroom. And finally, and this is unfortunate, this is fairly tragic, Brown passed away while she was still working on this project in 1999. Campione did continue to run these classrooms and do research in this vein, but it just wasn't the same. This was really a project that she was leading. When she passed away, a lot was left on the table. I believe that if she had lived longer and continued researching, we'd be hearing much more about this approach than we do now. Okay. So here are just some of the positions and accolades that Anne Brown was awarded throughout her career. You can see there's a whole bunch of them, president, vice president of this association, that association, this award, that award. I do want to point out here that in 2020, she was appointed as a distinguished university professor at the University of Michigan by Palinsar. Sort of went out of her way to give her that honor. I think that's a good sign of how strong the relationship was. And I also wanted to highlight that Brown had a position mentoring postdocs at the universities that she worked at, specifically at the University of Berkeley. And one of the sources that I read mentioned that she was particularly passionate about this, that she liked to mentor up-and-coming researchers and try to help them succeed in their careers. I think that's evident in Palinsar, who was really her mentee and went on to do a lot of great things. So as I mentioned, and I've been mentioning throughout this presentation, Anne Brown passed in 1999. She was in her mid-50s, still very young. It was a medical issue. Couldn't find a lot of details about exactly what it was or what happened, which again is very typical of Anne Brown and her immediate family. And I wouldn't want to pry any more than I have. These are just some quotes from people who knew her and worked with her. Eugene Garcia, the former dean of UC Berkeley's Education School, she won acclaim at both ends, from those who do research on teaching and from those who teach. She was dedicated, not just to research, but to making that pay off for kids, particularly poor children. Feel a deep sense of loss. Again, I think you can see that in the work that she did. Want to make a difference for people. Here's Howard Gardner. You may have heard of him. She was a warm and talented colleague who will be missed by many hundreds of people in the world of education. I found a number of statements besides these of people about Anne Brown from after she passed, and consistently people mentioned the warmth that she had and the kindness that she had, dedication to helping people. I think that's what really made an impression on people. So now we can cover Brown's ongoing legacy, of which I have identified 4 main categories. She's had an ongoing legacy in metacognition, which I mentioned before, still a hot topic today. She's influenced a lot of theoretical frameworks, especially reciprocal teaching, and to a lesser extent, fostering communities of learners have been cited as examples in a number of frameworks. Of course, there's design experiments which she innovated, which people still do today, and she's had an influence on educational practice as well. In terms of metacognition, it continues to be a mainline research topic. There are new perspectives being brought to metacognition on any given day, any given publication. These 2 papers from 2018 and 2021 both cite Brown as a foundational source. And specifically, of course, her work is influential in reading. Here's one from 2016 and one from 2023. Again, all of these papers cite Anne Brown as a foundational thinker. She's also had an impact on a number of theoretical frameworks, reciprocal teaching, and to a lesser extent, but still a notable extent, fostering communities of learners, are cited as key examples of a number of different theories. And I think it's very interesting that a lot of different theoretical perspectives on education and educational psychology feel as though they can cite reciprocal teaching as an example of their theory. And I think this is a perfect example of what Brown was going for with her research, this idea that a practical applied approach can have theoretical implications. I think that this is what she would have wanted. It seems like everybody could explain how reciprocal teaching supports their theory about learning and cognition. Very interesting. So it's been influential in the field of situated cognition. This is not Anne Brown, this is a different Brown, but this cites reciprocal teaching. Self-regulation has been influential. Zimmerman, 2013. This cites reciprocal teaching as an example of a way to teach people how to regulate their own learning. Cultural intelligence and learning. Tomasello has been a big name in this area and cites Anne Brown as and the reciprocal teaching as a way of learning through cultural approach, communal approach. And for scaffolding and tutoring, Brown's research has been very influential. Here's yet another paper that cites here, down here. And this is not to mention like cognitive load theory. I think Mayer has cited her and cited reciprocal teaching. Pintrich in the motivational context has talked about how reciprocal teaching is a good way to motivate students because it gives them responsibilities. Reciprocal teaching is brought up in John Hattie's relatively well-known visible learning meta-analysis as an effective teaching strategy. There's an approach called dialogic inquiry, which has a lot to say about reciprocal teaching and its influence on the field. Again, it's just had a really wide-ranging approach, and a lot of people from very different backgrounds have found a lot to like in it. Design experiments continue to be performed throughout the field of educational psychology and expanded on as well. I found some papers here that were specifically talking about design experiments themselves and design research and what's it useful for, how useful is it, how should it be done. And of course, design experiments are used in studies all the time. And it's to the point now where not everybody who does a design experiment even thinks of what they're doing as being a design experiment. It's just so normal to go set up a classroom, see what kind of educational results it gets, change something about it, try a new thing out in it, and see what the difference is. That's just something people do now in a way that they weren't really doing before Brown innovated the approach in the 70s. And finally, Brown has had an influence on educational practice largely through reciprocal teaching and the more broad contributions she made to reading comprehension strategies, summarizing, reflecting, questioning. All of these things are now normal things to recommend, and Brown was on the forefront of innovating those approaches. So there's some practice-oriented publications that talk about reciprocal teaching and implementing it in their practice, and there have been a handful of wider scale implementation programs which have taken reciprocal teaching as their approach. There's something called the Intro Connectors series, which was running in New Zealand and Australia for a good amount of time. But it's hard to know exactly how much influence reciprocal teaching and these approaches have had because, again, different teachers in different contexts will adopt this kind of recommendation for their students and will try reciprocal teaching in this classroom without necessarily documenting that they're doing it. But certainly there's been an impact there as well. Okay. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. I like to encourage people to ask questions in any context that I'm teaching, whatever the medium is. So if you have any, go ahead and leave them in the comments. And here are citations for the various papers and images that you saw referenced in this presentation, and these will also be in the description below. Okay. Again, just to summarize, Anne Brown, hopefully it came through in the presentation, someone who I have a lot of respect for, someone whose approach I really resonate with, and someone who I think is underrated and who we should have more appreciation for. So glad to have given this presentation and glad to be giving it again. All right. See you around.